Hi, everyone. Welcome to week two. This week we covered culture in our readings. So I will go over a summary essentially of the readings. It's not as long as last week's, so hopefully this slideshow will be a little bit shorter too. All right, so the first reading that we covered was titled Climbing Up the Rough Side of the Mountain: Hope, Culture, and Therapy. So this chapter explores the intersection of hope, culture, and therapy, especially within African American communities. It highlighted this author's struggle with feelings of hopelessness with clients' problems when they appear overwhelming or unresolvable. So Hines, the author, argues that hope is not only essential for clients, but also for us as therapists to have so that we can avoid projecting hopelessness onto our clients in sessions. Our perspective and our positionality is really important. Um, so Drawing from Paulette Moore Hines' work, uh, we're going to begin to see, or we're going to begin with the challenge that therapists often face, which is balancing our own sense of hopelessness with the resilience or despair that we see in clients. So this tension impacts both progress as well as therapist well-being. So like I said, hope is essential for therapy, and it's very important for us to see clients complexly. We tend to see clients when they are struggling. So it's very easy for us to paint this picture, maybe unknowingly, about these clients living in like constant despair. So I can't remember if it was my master's or my doctorate, but we read this article written by a couples therapist who basically was going over kind of a case study of this couple that they were struggling so badly in their relationship. Like they came to therapy and they were just constantly yelling at each other, constantly arguing. Um, and so he like really just started to see this couple as having that be their truth all the time. And then he talked about how he went to like a garage sale and either the clients were putting on the garage sale. I'm not sure, but I think they may have been like in the neighborhood, like maybe a neighbor of the garage sale that he went to. And he saw them like holding hands and laughing together. And it was a really big aha moment for him of how he had been kind of pigeonholing this couple into like just being eh, sad and like upset and just miserable all the time. So just I really want you to keep that in mind, that clients don't come to you and say, "Hey, let me tell you about all the like wonderful things that are going on in my life." They come to us to try to work through issues. So sometimes that can, unbeknownst to us, paint a fuller picture, or like a more biased picture, I guess I should say, than what is their truth. So keeping that in mind. So, in the concept of vicarious resilience, which was coined by Hernandez, Engstrom, and Gangse, this suggests that client or therapists can be empowered by their clients' survival skills. Instead of being weighed down by trauma stories, we can draw from strength from witnessing their perseverance. So, just thinking about that too, like be sure to ask about that. Be sure to ask about ways in which they have managed, ways in which they have endured. What they believe is their, like how they're resilient. Ask about these things, especially if you're finding yourself in a space of hopelessness. Like you got to pull hope from somewhere. So our beliefs deeply affect how we function, both emotionally and behaviorally. So in crisis, our beliefs serve as anchors, or they can create hopelessness. So therapy offers a space and maybe provides opportunities, you could say, to reframe beliefs in ways that foster hope and resilience. So thinking about assessing what are the client's beliefs and how do they anchor the client, again, potentially in a space of endurance, resilience, or in a space of hopelessness. So again, focusing more specifically in this chapter on African American culture, which is rich in oral traditions that transmit wisdom across generations. This is through things like proverbs, sermons, spirituals, stories, and these messages encourage perseverance and hope. They remind us of a collective strength and connect us both to, I guess I should say them. I'm not an African American, so they connect individuals within this population to both ancestors and descendants, so past and present, or past and future. So some spiritual, just talking about spiritual beliefs and how this may be important to some of your African American clients. Beliefs in God's justice, love, and guidance can provide security and resilience. So these may be very important aspects to understand and to bring into the therapeutic space. And these align with therapeutic values. So these beliefs of justice, love, and protection align with therapeutic values of forgiveness, courage, and respect for self and others. So there's definitely, when it comes to certain religious and spiritual beliefs, I think that those can absolutely be leveraged to align with just general tenets of therapy. So, some clinical implications. It's important for therapists to engage in cultural and spiritual resources while also reflecting on our own biases and potential hopelessness when clients come to us with really heavy stuff. Um, this should also help clients explore, evaluate, and reframe beliefs to foster resilience. So, again, coming into a space if your client is feeling hopeless, you need to bring the hope into this relationship. So just something to maybe pause on and think about, reflect on for yourself. Like reflect on your own sources of hope and renewal. So you can ask yourself things like, when do I feel hopeless? Who has supported me? What stories of resilience guide me? How do I sustain myself to continue this work? It's important. What's your why in some fashion? So, in conclusion, hope is not just an idea, it's an action. So, by drawing from cultural legacies and ancestral wisdom, both clients and therapists can find strength and overcome challenges and sustain resilience. So, we can, as therapists, draw from our own ancestral wisdom. We can draw from the ancestral wisdom of our clients and really bring that into the room. I think each of us have a different connection to our, like, what we would consider ancestral wisdom. So that's our first chapter. So then last week I covered this. I had a different syllabus than all of you. So if you are wanting like a recap information on the theoretical myth of sameness by Dr. Hardy, I covered that in week one's lecture. So let's talk about the inevitable whiteness of being white. So whiteness and the intersectionality in family therapy practice and training. So the central premise is that whiteness is the default lens in US culture. So when therapists and clients are white, race often fades into invisibility, but ignoring whiteness leads to incomplete therapy. So here, the authors emphasize that internalized superiority damages not only clients of color, but also white therapists and family. So we really want to bring this into making this like implicit, which like default makes things implicit. So not spoken, just like kind of understood. We want to make, I believe that one of the goals of therapy is to make what is implicit explicit. Let's talk about it. Even if something seems obvious, talk about it. Make sure that any potential thoughts you have, anything, assumptions that you have, that you check them. Okay, some historical context. So, um, things that have happened in our history, like slavery, genocide, exclusionary immigration laws, and suppressive systemic oppression, all affect even the foundation of our field. So even groups like Irish and Jewish immigrants initially were considered outsiders, but they were able to become white and benefit from privilege. So this history continues to shape how our clinical interactions happen today. So these are all things that we can't separate from contemporary therapy. So, in mental health, whiteness hides behind ideas of cultural competence and multiculturalism. So, the emphasis is on other groups, rarely on whiteness itself. So, this protects white therapists from discomfort but perpetuates harm. So, ultimately, what the authors of this chapter are insisting is that we have to examine whiteness directly. So in this chapter, it talks about intersectionality, which is it applies essentially intersectionality, which shows that whiteness intersects with other identities. So, for example, a white lesbian may feel marginalized for her sexuality, yet overlook her racial privilege. And I think this is such an issue in our field. And I think particularly like in training programs. So you have to look at every aspect of your identity. And yes, like we all have privileged as well as oppressed or marginalized identities. I mean, in many ways, all of us share in the privilege of education because we're here and we're learning. And sometimes some of those aspects have more weight. Um, so like regardless of, so for me, for example, regardless of any other marginalized characteristic or part of my identity, my like race and class are so protective that in many ways it can just uh like dominate over, like I guess for lack of a better term, trump other like marginalized aspects of my identity. So just wanting to keep that in the conversation. I know I mentioned it in the lecture last week of like we tend to lean into our marginalized identities because it's it's more accepted in some ways and it feels more comfortable, especially in spaces like academia, spaces like therapy. We have to talk about our privilege, and we also have to be in a space of not apologizing for our privilege or feeling shame about our privilege. Because I mean, same for like your I parts of your identity that are marginalized. Like my hope is that you don't feel shame about those as well. At the same time, I think what is can be really problematic in therapy because by virtue of the position that we have, we're in a privileged position, like being in the therapist position, we're in this powerful position. So if we try to like downplay parts of our privilege, or we try to be in this like apologetic space for it, we're really centering ourselves and our experience and taking away from anything that the client is bringing. So just think about that too of like what does shame and what does shame do? It centers your experience, and it's just like it doesn't have any place in therapy from the therapist perspective. I hope that that's making sense. So power defines what's considered normal. And in US culture, that normal is often identified or defined as white, cisgender, middle class. So, everything else is a quote unquote like deviation from that, which is tends to be othered, which then tends to be looked at in a space of like deficiency. Okay, so there was a case example that was a clinical case example, and then I'll talk about like the training example in the next slide. But this case example described a white therapist who strongly advocated for a white teen, and she was framing her violence as trauma related. So later, the therapist asked, would I have offered the same advocacy if she were Black and male? So this just identifies how whiteness shapes advocacy and decision making in therapy. So, I do think it's important to ask yourself, like, would I advocate in the same way? Would I share resources in the same way if clients were of different social locations? And if you find like, yeah, I might, then I just ask yourself why. What informs that? And that's not me saying like you can't do that. Like, so I don't want to elicit any shame or bring any shame here. What I really want throughout your time in this class is for you to really reflect on you and how you've come to believe what you do, how your positionality affects your personal identity, your professional identity. And to me, there's like all I want from you is to be honest. And if that means that you find that you do have some biased, maybe ist, um, like hyphenist, racist, sexist, all of those types of things, beliefs. Um, that's my hope is that you give yourself some grace in how you came to believe that, and that you work on finding a more humanizing perspective. So I'm not here to say like, oh yeah, like I am like racist against a certain race. That's okay. It's just like kind of who I am. Like that's not going to be my hope is that's not your end. That it's like, okay, I really need to investigate this. And I really want to understand how I came to believe this, how this shows up. And then I really want you to find ways to decrease that and eliminate that. And many times it's about exposure. Many times it's that we have these stereotypical, biased, discriminatory views towards certain groups, largely because we haven't had any personal exposure. Um, so, this doesn't have to be where you go and like dump to a trans person and say, like, teach me how to humanize trans people. We're not going to burden people like that. But like, I encourage you to like watch documentaries, go to festivals where maybe a certain group of people is highlighted and learn about their culture and things like that. So there's ways to do it. If you're wondering, reach out to me. Okay, so then they share a training example in this chapter where there's a white student who initially saw a client's aggression, so a training student, only as a reaction to divorce. But mapping identities revealed racism, adoption struggles, and cultural displacement. So this exercise helped the trainee to realize that his own whiteness had blinded him to the client's racial trauma. So it's very important to contextualize people. Like I said, we tend to look at people on that micro level. And I want you to broaden out to a larger macro level and also including the Chronos system. So I'm talking about Bronfenbrenner's socioecological model. If you're unfamiliar with that, I really encourage you to look that up and familiarize yourself with the different systems. So ultimately, there's a microsystem, mesosystem, exosystem, macrosystem, chronosystem, that all these systems affect us. And ultimately, the largest system, like impacts all the systems that are inside of it. There is a bidirectional nature to it, but we can't like isolate, for example, like a client's aggression, say like it's just about this divorce. So that's also what we would consider linear causality. Like the divorce caused the anger. And as couple and family therapists, as systemic thinkers, we don't think like that. We utilize what's called circular causality. So that means that we're looking at multiple factors that influence, like maybe an outcome or a behavior that we noticed, and also recognizing reciprocity, bidirectionality, that A affects B, that affects A, that affects B. So we're looking at that more so of multiple factors. We're always looking by multiple factors that affect somebody. So if you're ever saying like, oh, it's this thing that caused this, you're looking at it way too simply. You're missing a bunch of stuff. Okay, so the AVAF model was also covered in this chapter. So ultimately, this means acknowledge harm, validate the experience, act to change, apologize, and then allow the injured person to choose whether to forget. So this framework moves beyond guilt toward relational accountability. So ultimately, what is being encouraged here is that we use this in therapy and also model this so that our clients can use it. But again, looking at ourselves as in a position of power, repairing therapeutic ruptures is very important. So instead of like doubling down and saying, or maybe wondering if you messed up, but like not mentioning anything because you're afraid of what you'll hear. Like, I want you to lean into accountability so hard as in your identity as a therapist. Like, I've definitely asked questions to my clients where, like, I remember a session I had with a client, where I like really at the end was like after the session ended, because I found myself being like frustrated with her in the session. And so after the session, I was really reflecting and I'm like, man, I feel like I was too harsh. Like, I don't think I was really like giving her space to explore. I think I was like really imposing my perspective. And so the next session, I started the session by saying, like, is it okay if I like reflect a little bit on our session? She said, from last session, she said, sure. So you always want to ask for consent because your clients may not want to hear it. So I just said like, hey, I was really reflecting on like the way I spoke to you and kind of the approach I took. And I was feeling like maybe I was being too hard on you. And she said, like, what do you mean? Like, what are some examples? So I gave her some examples and she was just like, oh, I actually found that very helpful. So for what it's worth, like that's not the outcome of many, like all of these conversations. Um, but like it was something that was weighing on me that ultimately like didn't affect the client. So like if I wouldn't have brought it up, it ultimately was a non-issue for her, but it was an issue for me. So it was kind of a block. So I would have felt in the whole session and like any probably subsequent sessions that I was avoiding something that could have been harmful to her, because from my perspective, again, I thought I was being too harsh, but I was able to like clear that for me by checking in with her. So I think that if it is something that is bothering you and you believe that it may be getting in the way of the therapeutic process or even your ability to focus, your ability to be present, I encourage you to just speak to it. And once she said, "Oh my gosh, no, it was fine." I didn't go, "Are you sure?" Like, I was pretty harsh. I said, "Okay, thank you for allowing me the space to check in. Let's move on." So once it was dropped once it was known as a non-issue to her, I dropped it. I had to let like any of my guilt, any of my insecurity, any of that go, because my thoughts and feelings in the therapeutic space are secondary to my clients. Like, yeah, they're my tool and all that kind of stuff, but if I am bringing an energy into the space that's not relevant to my client, I have to let that go. So again, I hope that example makes sense too. So some guidelines that were offered, I think there were like 10 guidelines or something like that were offered, but I'm highlighting 5 of them here. So recognizing your micro entitlements, ways in which you don't have to like worry about stuff or things that you believe that you're entitled to, um, like your opinion in all spaces. You are entitled to voice your thoughts in all spaces. Um, like think about that and uh The color blindness was also something that was talked about here. So again, color blindness only perpetuates the status quo. It only gives more power to white supremacy and systems of oppression. So if you are saying, I don't see color, you are missing huge, relevant characteristics of people's identities. And then staying accountable, like I said, I want this to be if like the most accountable role that you occupy in your life. So they also stress the importance of addressing racism, even when it feels uncomfortable, and joining supportive professional communities to sustain lifelong work, understanding, like being able to have a space to consult, have a space to share, have a space to relate to others. So those are, five of the 10 that were offered. So, in conclusion, whiteness cannot remain invisible. It must be explicitly examined in therapy and in training. That's what I'm trying to do here, too. Accountability, repair, and solidarity with colleagues and clients of color are ethical imperatives. So, if you're not engaging with in a professional way with people who don't look like you, do it. And also don't have them be a representative or explain things or teach you. Like it should be a mutually beneficial relationship. It shouldn't be one where one is taking and another is giving. Just really making sure that these relationships are equitable. And this chapter also ends with a call for white therapists to commit to this work, not out of guilt, but as a through a path to become more authentic, just, and engage in more healing relationships. So then the next article that we read was a study that examines how racial differences influence therapeutic relationships between racial minority clients and white therapists. So, highlighting both the challenges and opportunities that arise in this. So, the purpose of the study was ultimately threefold. And it was to explore racial dynamics in therapy, particularly cross racial dynamics, as I said, to better understand clients' perspectives. So the authors wanted to identify what makes cross therapy or cross racial therapy satisfying or dissatisfying, focusing on both therapist factors and client factors. So here they interviewed 16 racial and ethnic minority clients who had seen white European American therapists. And the researchers used phenomenology and consensual qualitative research methods. And these methods focus on capturing the lived experiences of participants and analyzing them in depth to find common themes. So the therapist factors, findings that they found on therapist factors was that clients reported greater satisfaction when therapists used an active style, meaning that they gave feedback, they asked questions, or they taught coping skills. On the other hand, therapists who minimized or ignored racial issues or displayed cultural insensitivity contributed to dissatisfaction. So self-disclosure was mixed in terms of feedback here, that it could build trust when done appropriately, but could harm the relationship if it was deemed irrelevant by the client. So, professionalism, which encompassed being prepared, attentive, and respectful, was also seen as critical. So, some client factors. Some clients minimize the importance of race in therapy, while others found it central. So, different feedback on how important it was. Satisfied clients often found ways to see advantages in cross-racial therapy, such as gaining a broader perspective or feeling safe to discuss more taboo topics. Dissatisfied clients reported that their racial concerns were ignored, dismissed, or not properly understood. So in terms of relational factors, it played a significant role in this. So strong therapeutic alliances formed when therapists demonstrated cultural responsiveness, addressed misunderstandings, and repaired ruptures when they occurred. So this goes back to accountability. In contrast, dissatisfied clients what was common in dissatisfaction was when therapists ignored client feedback or failed to engage in racial issues when the clients brought them up. So, some implications. Cultural competence is essential. So it's not just a buzzword, but this is a lived practice. Therapists must acknowledge privilege and the realities of race, even in cross-racial, and I would say especially in cross-racial contexts. Repairing ruptures is critical to rebuilding trust. And finally, what I talked about before, accountability is key. Clients benefit when therapists own their mistakes and work to correct them. Okay. So I believe the last thing that we read this week was on cultural identity development and family assessment by Gushu. So this work highlights the limitations of culture-free models and stresses the importance of integrating cultural identity into both assessment and therapeutic practice. So what is the problem with traditional family assessment? So, traditional family assessment models often assume universality, but in reality, they reflect the norms of white middle class populations. So they say, "Hey, this applies to everyone," but really, if you look at like who created them and the culture that they've been exposed to, just meaning like U.S. culture, 'cause many of our approaches are based in the U.S., created in the U.S. That there is a kind of a default, quote unquote, like invisible norm. So this creates a risk of labeling cultural differences as dysfunction or pathologizing cultural differences. So the author argues that assessments are incomplete and potentially harmful if we don't pay attention to, and in some ways even centralize cultural identity. So cultural identity develops both through personal self-definition as well as through relational dynamics within families and communities. So it evolves in stages, and where a person is in this developmental process shapes how they interact with family members. It also shapes how they interact with society as well as within the therapeutic process themselves. So understanding their cultural identity development is very important, and understanding where they're at in it um, is also really important because that it the way that they see the world, the way that they interact with the world is informed by that. And if you think that they're in a different place than they are, like I'm just thinking about like, hopefully making this very relevant to all of you that, we have a like professional developmental model for therapists. And I think it's like 6 stages or something like that. And as we know, any like staged theory is inherently limited, right? Because like we don't develop in clean stages, things like that. It's more of just meant to be like a like a framework that should be fluid, but it gives us vocabulary. I think it gives us like a relatively accurate lens of how to look at people, but I want to encourage you not to look at people in like, cleanly in stages, because you're going to see aspects of various stages. But anyway, with this like stages of development of therapists, there's a stage where essentially like where many of you will be when you start in practicum is you'll be trying to like imitate the creators, or you'll say to yourself like how would a solution focused therapist look at this, and then you'll get to a stage like later on where you say here's my theory of change and here's how I'll use theories to help in my work, or to like guide my work, assist in my work. And you can hopefully you can hear like a difference between those two. Then there's like where you are totally in your own space, you feel very grounded. This is like, 15, 20 years into doing this, where you're not trying to imitate anyone, you have lived experience and things like that. So if you're in the space of just like trying to figure out how to apply theories, but I am talking to you as if you like know who you are in your professional identity, you're grounded in that, theories in and out. What I'm going to be talking to you, the way I'm going to be talking to you is going to be like very irrelevant. So hopefully that is like an applicable, relatable example to place here. Okay, so the relevance of this to family therapy. So it's common for family members to be at different stages of identity development. This can cause misunderstandings or even conflict, for example, between parents holding traditional values and children negotiating bicultural identities. Therapists must be culturally competent to navigate these dynamics. So recognizing that you're going to be talking to people who are in different places in their cultural identity development. So, some clinical implications: clinicians can use culturally responsive tools such as genograms that include cultural, racial, and migration histories, like what we talked about last week. They should ask intentional questions about traditions, values, and experiences of discrimination. And just as importantly, therapists should highlight resilience and cultural strengths as a part of the therapeutic process, just like we talked about in earlier in this presentation. So, in conclusion of this whole thing, the author emphasizes that cultural identity must be central to family assessment. So, when therapists integrate cultural contexts, they avoid pathologizing difference and they help clients and families build on their cultural strength. This approach supports more accurate, respectful, and ultimately more effective therapy. And that is all I have for you.